Some cases don't get explained. They don't get labeled as supernatural, and they don't get dismissed either. They just remain unclassified. A senior orthopedic surgeon once described one of those cases. Late 1980s, South Asia. UN medical assignment. A night that started like any other emergency call and ended in a way he could never fully categorize. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything felt normal, while clearly not behaving like normal should. He never described it as a hallucination. He never attributed it to stress, and he never tried to convince anyone it was real. He simply reported what he experienced, and even decades later, he couldn't decide what disturbed him more: the call, the hospital, or the fact that everything functioned exactly as expected, without ever feeling fully real. Welcome back. Here, we document real experiences shared by viewers, stories that begin in ordinary circumstances and slowly lose structural consistency. If you have a story you want featured, truehorrorfilesit@gmail.com. New episodes every Friday and Sunday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Tonight's account comes from a viewer's uncle, a senior orthopedic surgeon, a man trained to rely only on what can be observed, measured, and confirmed. But one night, those rules stopped applying. Let's begin. It happened around 1 a.m. The phone rang. A landline. Back then, that meant only one thing. The hospital needed him. He picked up. The voice on the other end was unclear, strained, almost distorted through distance. An emergency case, no details, just urgency. He got dressed immediately and left. This wasn't unusual for him, but later he would recall something subtle about that moment. The call didn't feel like a request. It felt like confirmation of something already decided. Still, he went. Outside, transport was already waiting. He never clearly remembered arranging it, but it was there. The ride felt unusually smooth, too efficient, like distance itself wasn't behaving normally. Within minutes, he arrived at the hospital area, but when he stepped out, everything was silent. No movement, no voices, no activity. At first, he assumed it was simply early, but the silence didn't feel natural. It felt complete, like sound itself had been removed rather than absent. Inside, everything looked operational. Lights were on, machines were running, doors were open, but there was no one at the front desk, no nurses, no security. He called out once, no response. What unsettled him wasn't emptiness. It was how normal everything looked while being completely empty, like the hospital was functioning without requiring people inside it. He moved deeper into the building. That's when he saw an elderly man sitting alone in a corner. He asked what was happening. The man didn't respond clearly, only confusion, as if the question itself didn't fully register. Then, 4 figures appeared, all dressed in white coats, moving with unnatural coordination. Not fast, not slow, just perfectly synchronized. One of them spoke. "You are the doctor." It wasn't phrased as a question, and it wasn't entirely a statement either. More like confirmation. He responded, Yes. A pause followed. Then, the patient has arrived. Another pause. Then, the patient will not survive. And still, they told him to follow. He hesitated, not out of fear, but because the instruction didn't feel like a request anymore. It felt like something already in motion, like his choice was no longer part of the equation. And before he could fully analyze that thought, he was already moving. Not consciously, not decisively, just continuing, as if resistance never fully formed. As they walked, something subtle began to shift. The hospital layout felt familiar, but not entirely correct. Distances seemed slightly compressed. Corners arrived earlier than expected. Doors appeared closer than they should have been. Nothing was physically wrong, but perception didn't align cleanly with structure. One of the figures spoke again. Everything is prepared. He tried to process that statement logically. Prepared for what? But the thought didn't stabilize long enough to complete itself. It broke apart before reaching meaning. The doors opened. Inside was the operating room. Everything appeared functional. Machines running, lights stable, staff in position, but none of it felt fully connected. Like each element existed slightly out of sync with the others. Not broken, just not fully aligned in the same moment. He stepped inside, and immediately, something shifted in how the room felt. Not visually, but perceptually, as if his mind had to recalibrate before meaning could form. The white figures took position around him. No instruction, no explanation, just placement. As if the procedure had already been assigned. He looked at the patient, but it took longer than expected for his mind to classify what he was seeing. That delay unsettled him more than the condition itself. One of them spoke. "You may begin." No urgency, no emphasis, just timing. He reached for the instruments and noticed something unusual. His movements felt slightly detached, like he was observing himself perform actions he already understood. Not controlled, but not fully authored either. As the procedure began, the room grew quieter, not in sound, but in interpretation. Audio still existed, machines still functioned, but meaning arrived with delay, like each signal needed translation before becoming real. At one point, he paused, not because something was wrong, but because he couldn't immediately confirm that everything was right. That uncertainty didn't feel emotional. It felt structural, like his ability to validate reality was weakening slightly. A voice broke through. "Continue." He couldn't tell which figure spoke, and for a moment, he realized he had stopped distinguishing between them as individuals. They were no longer separate. Only presence. The procedure continued, but time no longer felt linear. Actions didn't feel sequential. They felt assembled, like steps arranged in advance. Then, silence. Not sudden, just complete. A clean removal of sound. A voice said calmly, "It is done." In an instant, everything normalized. The figures were gone. The staff returned, confused, disoriented, like waking from something they couldn't recall. Many reported no memory. Some described blank time. The hospital was fully functional again, active, normal. But for him, something didn't reset. Not fear, not confusion. Something harder to define. A lingering sense that reality had briefly stopped following its own rules. He tried to explain it logically. Stress, fatigue, psychological strain. But none of it fully accounted for what he experienced, because it wasn't just something he witnessed. It was something he moved through, as if reality itself had temporarily shifted structure. Over time, he stopped speaking about it, not because he understood it, but because he didn't. And some experiences don't resolve. They simply remain, unclassified. So the question is, what do you think happened that night? Have you ever experienced something that felt completely real in the moment, but made no sense afterward? If you have a story of your own, something strange, unsettling, or unexplainable, send it to truehorrorphilsite@gmail.com. Because some experiences don't end when the night ends. They stay, long after everything else returns to normal. Until next time.